Good morning. If you would open your Bible to the book of 1 Timothy chapter 6. And this morning we're going to be in verses 6 through 10. We've been going through 1 Timothy for several months now, and we're almost finished with 1 Timothy, and then we'll be in 2 Timothy. The title of the sermon this morning is Learning to be Content. We'll be talking about the topic of contentment this morning. So let's read the text. I'll open us in a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into the sermon this morning. 1 Timothy chapter 6, beginning in verse 6, if you will follow along in your copy of God's Word or on your smartphone with me. Paul writes, "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." If you'll pray with me. God, it is our desire to take your word seriously and to be content, Lord, to learn how to be content. And we confess, and I confess, God, that I don't do that well. And I imagine many here have the same struggle. And we need your help, Lord, to learn how to be content with what you've given us. And Lord, I pray that this morning, this text and the words that you've spoken through the Apostle Paul to his disciple Timothy would help us in that process, would help us to be content. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. This morning I want to begin with an exposition of the text, and then I'll follow it up with application. We have a lot to get to, so I figured we just jump right into the text this morning. And we're going to go through it verse by verse, and then I'll give application at the end. So I hope you have your copy of God's Word. If not, there's some Bibles on the back bookshelf. You can grab one of those or follow along your smartphone. But 1 Timothy chapter 6, we're going to go through verse by verse, beginning in verse 6. Paul writes here, "But godliness with contentment is great gain." Now, and previously, the verses that we did not look at last week, in verses 2 to 5, Paul had just warned Timothy that there are false teachers in Ephesus, which is where this is, who believe that godliness is the means of gain, that they could use godliness to get rich. Okay? And now in verse 6, Paul wants to contrast this, to say godliness is not the means of gain, godliness is the gain, but godliness with contentment. Now, of course, that raises a question for us. What is contentment? Have you ever asked yourself that? What is contentment? I'd be willing to venture that if we took a survey of all 40 to 50 of us and had us write down what is contentment and wrote out a definition, we'd get back about 10 to 20 different answers. And I think that's part of the problem, is that why we wrestle so much with contentment is that we probably don't have a very good, and I don't even know that I do, a very good understanding of what contentment is. So I think it would be helpful for us to discuss what contentment is and what it is not. Anytime we're trying to understand something, we need to first clarify what is it not. So that's where we're going to start here. What contentment is not. I'm going to give us 5 ideas of what contentment is not. And I think we need to start here. So here they are. A, contentment is not complacency. Complacency is defined as a feeling of being satisfied with how things are and not wanting to try to make them better. That's not contentment. This reminds me of the parable of the talents. Remember the parable of the talents where Jesus says that one man was given 10, one was given 5, and one was given 1. And the guy who had 10 made 10 more. The guy who had 5 made 5 more. And the guy who had 1 went and buried it in the ground. Now you might argue, well, he was just content with 1. He was very content with that 1. That's not the truth. He was complacent with his 1. Complacency is not contentment. There's a difference between the two. Being okay with the status quo is not contentment. It's complacency. Being okay with where we are in our fight against sin or in our walk with God. And like, I'm just really content with where I am with God. That's not contentment. That's complacency if we're not where we should be. All right? We would do well to not confuse those two. Contentment is not complacency. B, contentment is not passive acceptance. We might confuse contentment with what we often call fatalism, which is kind of this mentality like, well, it is what it is. I'm just going to have to accept life. That's the way it is. That's not contentment. That's passive acceptance. Contentment is not passive acceptance. God is not glorified by passive acceptance. God has called us as Christians to active joy, not passive acceptance. C, it's not self-sufficiency. The Greek term that's used here for contentment in 1 Timothy is, it'll be on the screen here, autarkeia. It actually means sufficiency. That's what it literally means. It was a favorite virtue by the Greek Stoics and the Cynics. They loved it. But we have to be careful that we don't equate contentment with their idea of sufficiency. I like what William Mounce writes. The quote will be on the screen for you. William Mounce writes, for them, meaning the Greeks, it meant self-sufficiency, that a man should be sufficient unto himself for all things and able by the power of his own will to resist the force of circumstances. It is this quality that produces the stereotypical characterization of the proverbial stoic, standing in the wind with a strong jaw, willing to face anything that circumstances and the fates might send. There is no question that Paul is playing off the Greek usage, that godliness that is profitable is not dependent on circumstances, specifically riches, but godly contentment is not dependent on a person's inner strength apart from Christ. G.G. Finley says the self-sufficiency of the Christian is relative, an independence of the world through dependence on God. The Stoic self-sufficiency pretends to be absolute. One is contentment of faith, the other of pride. Cato and Paul both stand erect and fearless before a persecuting world, one with the look of rigid, defiant scorn, the other with a face now lighted up with the unutterable joy in God. Contentment is not a stoic view of self-sufficiency. And then D, not financial legalism. We could easily take Paul's words in verse 7 here, where he says, with food and clothing we'll be content, and then mean that, look, all we ever need is food and clothing. So if I don't even have shelter, if I don't have my health, I should be content. I just need food and clothing. That would be kind of a form of financial asceticism, or what we call poverty theology, taking up a life of a monk or a Buddhist. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but that's not what Paul's preaching here. That's what we need to do, and if we're not living like a monk or a Buddhist, that we're not content. I like what the evangelical commitment to simple lifestyle says. That's a mouthful. Here's what they write. We resolve to renounce waste and oppose extravagance in personal living, clothing, housing, travel, and church buildings. We also accept the distinction between necessities and luxuries, creative hobbies and empty status symbols, modesty and vanity, occasional celebrations and normal routine, and between the service of God and slavery to fashion. Where to draw the line requires conscientious thought and decision by us together with the members of our family. I think that those are helpful distinctions, one that we would do well. Contentment could easily become legalism if we don't filter it through the Spirit. And then E, contentment is not prayerlessness. Listen, if I am single and I desire to be married, but I know that I should be content, that does not mean it's wrong to pray for a spouse. If I want a job and I desire to be employed, but I also know I should be content, that does not mean it's wrong to pray for a job. Contentment does not negate prayer or even consistent and devoted prayer. Contentment negates grumbling, dissatisfaction, joylessness, complaining, anxiety, worldly pursuits, but not prayer. Contentment is not prayerlessness. So 5 things contentment is not. It's not complacency. It's not passive acceptance. It's not self-sufficiency. It's not financial legalism. And it's not prayerlessness. So what is it? What is contentment? You know, I really thought about how to define this term. And I was sitting in my office just like wrestling through, how do I define this? This is so hard. It's kind of like joy or love. Like if I asked you to define joy or love, how do you define that in a short, simple definition? I even asked my wife, like, how would you define this? Here's my best definition of contentment, as short as I possibly can put it. And I was able to boil it down, in my mind, to 3 words. And here it is. Jesus is enough. I take this definition from Hebrews 13:5. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. Now, I like that verse a lot because it raises the question of, what's the connection there? Author of Hebrews, we don't know who wrote it. Author of Hebrews, what's the connection there? What's the connection between being content and this promise that God said, I will never leave you or forsake you? How does that promise fuel contentment? Well, let me give an illustration that might shed some light on this. Let's say that I was on a business trip and I was out of town. And while I was out of town, in my hometown, a tornado came through and wiped out my entire neighborhood. All of it gone. House, possessions, I've lost everything. Fly back from my business trip. I come to my neighborhood. I can't find my family anywhere. I haven't gotten a phone call. I haven't gotten a text message. I haven't gotten an email. I have no idea where they are. I have no idea if they're alive. I have no idea. All I know is I've lost everything. A day goes by. 2 days go by. An entire week goes by. And one day I get a phone call from an agency that says, hey, we have a family down here. We don't know if it's your family. Will you please come down and verify if this is your family? And I walk down to the agency. When I get there, I see my wife and my 4 boys there. Do you think I care at all about my possessions? Do you think I care at all about my house? Do you think I care about anything else in the world in that moment? I am perfectly content in that moment. Why? Because I have what's most valuable to me. How does that promise fuel contentment? Because no matter what happens, I have God. And I will always have Him. And He will never leave me. He will never forsake me. Ever. And therefore I can be content with no matter what happens. Just like I don't care, you could wreck 50 houses as long as I have my family. No matter what happens, I have Jesus. Jesus is enough. That's how that fuels it. That's what contentment is. Jesus is enough. Verse 7. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. This is such a simple truth, but one that is so difficult to live by. This statement reminds me of the words of Job. Job was a wealthy man who had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the East. And in one day, he lost all of it. And his response was to losing everything. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. It's the same idea in verse 7 here. Or listen to how another rich man named Solomon describes it. Solomon was a man who had everything he could ever want. He had riches beyond counting. He had fame, glory, honor, power, women, wisdom. He had it all. And yet listen to how he describes it. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Sweet is the sleep of the laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. There is a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is the father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Same exact idea as Paul gives in verse 7. This week I was thinking of a story to illustrate verse 7, and the illustration kind of became real to me on a very trivial way. I don't have very many possessions that I care about. Ultimately, don't really care that much about them. But the ones that I do care a lot about are the ones that are sentimental to me. And I lost my watch this week. I'll come back to that in a second. But let me give the illustration and what Paul is saying in verse 7. Suppose there was a woman who went on a cruise ship, and it was a 2-month cruise around the world. She had waited 20 years to take this trip. She saved up for 20 years because a 2-month cruise around the world would be expensive, and she had saved up all of her savings and spent it on this. She had wanted to do this for 20 years. When she goes on the cruise, she has one purpose, one objective: to collect exotic fruit. And so when she gets off at each island and each country, she collects this exotic fruit and she brings it back to her, her room or whatever. I've never been on a cruise, so I don't even know what they look like. And she brings it back to her room, and her room's just stockpiled with exotic fruit. I mean, she plans to make jams and jellies and dry it, and she's that's been her whole life focus. I've always wanted to collect exotic fruit around the world. And so she spends her entire cruise, all 2 months. That's the one thing she does. At the end of the 2 months, the ship goes back to customs, and when she gets to customs, they say, "You can't bring any of this with you. You can't bring food through customs." How would you feel? This past week when I lost my watch, and I was really just I felt like Jonah when the plant got eaten by the worm. I was just kind of sulking, just like, dang. I was really frustrated because my wife gave me the watch. It was like one of the first gifts she gave me. It meant a lot to me. It still means a lot to me. If any of you have it, please let me know. And as I was driving home from a basketball game on Tuesday night, I was in my car thinking about this illustration. It was like God spoke to me using my own illustration. Matt, you can't take it with you. You can't take your watch with you. Just like the woman can't take the exotic fruit with her, you can't take your watch with you. And I'm like, well, yes, I know, but I want to enjoy it now, at least for a few years. And God's like, well, but you can't take it with you. You see, verse 7 really changes the way we live. When you begin to realize that this whole life is just temporary, it's just a passing through. It's you can't take any of it with you. Verse 8, but if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Now, obviously, food and clothing here is not meant to be exhaustive. Paul's not saying if you don't have health or shelter, we have to be content. This is a synecdoche or a metonymy for basic needs. All right? I think he's essentially saying, look, if we have our basic needs met, we can be content. We can be satisfied. We often think of basic needs as that which we need to survive. Paul says, no. Basic needs is enough to be satisfied, to be content. That's what that word content can also mean, is satisfied. Verse 9, but those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. I'll talk more about this in the application. What Paul is arguing here is not all temptations are created equal. Some temptations are more dangerous than others because some temptations are a portal to other sins or other temptations. The desire for money can easily lead us down a path of more sin. Greed for more money, lack of generosity, lack of integrity, idolatry of work or money or savings, idolatry of possessions, idolatry of shopping or buying power or keeping up an image. The desire for money is a portal that will lead to more sin. That's why not all temptations are created equal. This is a dangerous temptation that Paul is warning us of. And then verse 10, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many pangs. The love of money. I want to remind us, as I did when I preached on this passage in the Overseers, the sermon title, Not a Lover of Money, that I hope we would not be quick to defend, I'm not a lover of money. I think that's our first inclination, right? When we hear about this, or if someone were to, we read a book or preach, like, I'm not a lover of money. Be very careful to not be quick to defend that. Paul writes that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Now, two things Paul is not saying here. We often hear people say the love of money is the root of all evil. That's not what he's saying, all right? Two things he's not saying. A, it's not the root, it is a root. All right? Money is not the root of all evil. It is a root. And then B, it's not a root of all evil. It is a root of all kinds of evil. I think we have to be careful we distinguish that. There are plenty of sins that don't find their source in money. But it is a root that leads to a lot of sin in this world. We all heard the phrase, money makes the world go round. It's the very lifeblood of our society. And it's also the lifeblood of much evil in this world. People will often say what the world needs is a little more love, and that's absolutely true. But what the world also needs is a little more contentment. So what do we do with all this? That's our text. Application. 5 points of application. The first is a question. Number 1, where do I struggle with contentment? I think anytime we're talking about this topic, when we talk about money or contentment or possessions, we should always begin by looking in the mirror and asking ourselves, where do I struggle with contentment? The reality is everybody struggles with contentment. It's one sin that everybody wrestles with. There are many sins that everybody wrestles with, but this is one of them. Adam and Eve. The first sin was ultimately a lack of contentment. They struggled finding contentment with the 99 trees that God had provided them to eat from, and they coveted to have that one tree. Abraham and Sarah struggled with finding contentment on waiting on God's promise to be fulfilled, and they coveted having the promised child now, and they took matters in their own hands. The Israelites struggled with finding contentment in the desert. They struggled with finding contentment with the manna and quail and water from the rock that God had provided, and they coveted being in the promised land now. Achan struggled with contentment of defeating Jericho and what he was going to get from that. But he saw a beautiful cloak from Shinar and 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels. And he coveted it and took it, and it cost him his life. David struggled with finding contentment with his wife. And he coveted another man's wife, which led him to adultery and murder. Solomon was not content with one woman, but he coveted 999 more. Brother wasn't all that wise. Jonah struggled with being content with God's will in Nineveh. God said, my will for you, Jonah, is to go to Nineveh. Jonah was not content with that, but he coveted his freedom in Tarshish. Judas was not content with being one out of only 12 men in history to be the disciples of Jesus, and he coveted 30 pieces of silver. Ananias and Sapphira were not content with giving all of their money to the apostles, or at the very least being honest about what they did give, and they coveted the praise of false generosity. And all of these stories and more cause me to ask myself, Matt, Where are you struggling with being content? Church family, where are you struggling to be content? Is it our job? Or where you're at in your job? Or what job you have? Or how well people think about your job? Is it finances? Is it your marriage? A lot of people are discontent with their marriage. Maybe for good reason, maybe not. Parenting, singleness. A lot of people, I was a very discontent single. It was my aim to find a woman as fast as I could. And I did. But I spent a lot of years being discontent. Possessions, friends, our home, social status, how much we get to travel, how much we get to do a hobby, our church body. Are you content with this church? I am. Are you? I hope so. Free time? Where do we struggle with contentment? I want to encourage us to do an exercise. You might even do this at your small group this week. To sit down and write out 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 areas where you wrestle with contentment. Write it out on a piece of paper. Be really honest with yourself. And then ask yourself, when you look at those areas, ask yourself this question: why do I struggle to believe that Jesus is enough in these areas? Why do I struggle with that? 2, second point of application. Contentment is learned. Paul wrote in verse 8, "But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content." I mean, don't you love how Paul's just like very straightforward? He's like, look, if we have food and clothing, we're going to be content. And we're like, whoa, Paul. Like, maybe you're content with just being in prison and having food and clothing, but that's not me, Paul. It's not that easy. You can't just oversimplify that, Paul. Doesn't it ever frustrate you or anger you in your life when something bad happens? Like you lose your job and the person says, well, at least you have your health. They're essentially saying be content. Or a relationship didn't work out in your life and you're really hurt and they're like, well, there's other fish in the sea. They're essentially saying be content. Or you didn't get into the school that you wanted. You always wanted to go to UW or Princeton or whatever, and you didn't get in. You're like, that's okay, buddy. You'll get them next time. They're essentially saying be content. Doesn't that anger you? And the reason is because contentment's not easy. It's not that easy to be content. It doesn't come naturally, and we all know it. We all know that it's not that natural and easy to be content. That's why this sermon's called Learning to be Content. Paul wrote to the Philippians, "Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content." Paul didn't naturally be content overnight. He learned to be content. Contentment is learned. It's something God refines in us. Paul goes on to say in the book of Philippians, right after that passage, "I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Now, certain people whose last name begins with a T and ends with a bow will put that on, a thing to say like this idea of like, I can abound through Christ who strengthens me. Or I can face plenty through God who strengthens me. Or I can have abundance through God who strengthens me. And kind of take this verse out of context to say that we can do all these great things through God who strengthens us. But we also need to realize it also means I can be brought low and find contentment through God who strengthens me. I can face hunger and find contentment through God who strengthens me. I can be in need and find contentment through God who strengthens me. Contentment does not come naturally to anybody. But don't get discouraged by that. Don't get discouraged by that, because God is refining that in us. There are some trials that God brings into your life and my life for no other purpose than to cultivate contentment. That's why the trial exists. 3, godliness with contentment is great gain. I take this directly from verse 6. Godliness with contentment is great gain. I ask myself, what do we as a society view as great gain? And I really ask myself the more important question, does the church view that any differently? Do we as Christians have a different view of what is great gain, any differently than the world? So I began compiling a list of what do we as a society view as a great gain. Education. We view being educated as great gain. Getting a job, especially if it's a high-paying job or a high-profile job, we view that as being great gain. Owning a home, we view that as great gain. Talent, if someone's really gifted in music or an athlete, we look at the Seahawks and say, man, that's great gain. Richard Sherman committing pass interference and not getting called is great gain, right? We view that as great gain. Or musicians, social status, being well-liked, having many friends, being thought of as cool or funny. If you're a very well-liked person, that's great gain. Buying power, being able to take vacations whenever I want to take them, being able to eat at any restaurant whenever I want to eat there is great gain. Relationships, dating, we view, somebody gets in a relationship, we're like, man, that's great gain. Or even marriage, though I think marriage kind of lost some of its luster as great gain. We need to regain that. But financial security, peace of mind, knowing like, hey, I've got a nice nest egg, I've got a nice thing saved up for many years to come, I'm financially secure, that's great gain. These are all things that the world views as great gain. And unfortunately, the church is often no different. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that those aren't great gain. All right? The point of this point is not to say those aren't great gain. I simply want to challenge us as Christians, as the church, to ask, what does God view as great gain? In the eyes of God, what does He look down upon and see as great gain? And Paul says, godliness with contentment is great gain. That almost seems paradoxical, doesn't it? Now, I want to give one piece of counsel before I move on here. It's not going to feel like great gain. It is not going to feel like it. Being a man or a woman of prayer is not going to feel like great gain. Being a man or a woman who meditates on the Word of God is not going to feel like great gain. Being a man or a woman who shares the gospel with their coworkers and their family is not going to feel like great gain. Spending time investing and discipling your children is not going to feel like great gain. May I remind you and encourage you and exhort you that God says godliness with contentment is great gain. A person who can be godly and believe that Jesus is enough for them is great gain. 4, money can be and often is a trap. A trap that doesn't just damage but destroys. I don't know if there's a place in the New Testament where the writer is more direct and blunt and harsh than the language here that Paul uses in verses 9 and 10. Look at the direct and blunt language here in verses 9 and 10. Verse 9, Paul writes, but those who desire to be rich fall. That word fall literally means to fall into, like falling into a ditch. It's the same word. They aren't tempted. They actually fall into the temptation. Verse 9, they fall into a snare. You know what a snare is? It's a trap. You know what's the problem with the trap? Is that it's a trap. It looks so promising. It looks so rewarding. It looks so inviting, like it's going to make my life better. But it's a trap. it bites horribly in the end. Verse 9, they fall into many senseless and harmful desires, or foolish and harmful. How many times have we or someone we known pleaded with someone to stop smoking, or because it might cause cancer, or using drugs because they're going to waste away all their money, or getting drunk every weekend because they're going to do something stupid, or gambling away all of their money, or eating unhealthy? How many times, have we exhorted someone to stop making foolish decisions and harmful decisions for their body or their life? And we tried to plead with them saying, this is destructive. And Paul reminds us that money is no different. Money is probably far more dangerous than cocaine or alcohol or cigarettes. Verse 9. Harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. The word plunge there, it literally means sinks them, like a boat. It sinks them. Verse 9, ruin and destruction. When these words are used, ruin and destruction, they aren't used in the context of ruining or destroying finances. They're used in the context of ruining and destroying a soul. Eternal ruin, eternal destruction. That's how the New Testament writers use these terms. These desires are so dangerous that they plunge many people into eternal destruction. Verse 10, some have wandered away from the faith. This makes me think about the prodigal son who wandered away from the father with his wealth in his hand. And by the grace of God, he was able to return to his father. But may we never forget, there are many who make that same decision and they never come back. They don't come back to the father. They wander only to keep wandering. And they have pierced themselves with many pangs. The Net Bible translates this better. Literally, they have stabbed themselves with many pangs or pains. It's a graphic illustration that Paul is giving here. So I want to give you a parable. We talked about on Friday about parables. I wrote a parable to illustrate verse 9 and 10. One day a man found a treasure map that would lead him to an insurmountable treasure. It was buried at the bottom of this sea. He needed a boat, but he doesn't have a boat. So he comes up with a plan to sell everything he has and buy a boat. And he does. He takes that boat out to the middle of the sea, follows the map, dives down to the bottom of the sea, and he sees this treasure. That is enormous. He brings one bag of gold up, puts it in his boat. Dives back down, grabs another bag of gold, puts it in his boat. And he does this over and over and over again. Now he is so busy diving down, getting the bags of gold and putting them in his boat that he doesn't realize his boat is slowly sinking in the water. All he can see is the gold at the bottom of the sea. He wants to grab as much as he can, and the boat gets lower and lower and lower to eventually water level, and the boat begins taking on water. When he comes up the last time, he begins to see that it's taking on water, but it's too late. A little bit of water comes in, more, and the boat sinks. And he is too far to swim back. Do you know what that map was? It wasn't a treasure map. It was a trap that proved to be very foolish and harmful for him. It plunged his boat and his life into ruin and destruction. He wandered away from living a very content life. He had a good thing going. And he pierced not only his boat, but himself. Money can be, and often is, a trap that doesn't just damage, but often destroys. 5, last point. Put parameters in place to guard ourselves against the love of money and to build contentment. You know, when we read this text, it's a little bit scary, right? Or at least it should be. It scares me. Especially for someone who wrestles, if not flat out, is committing idolatry of savings. So how do I guard? How do I not be like this man who sunk his boat? How do I do that? I came across something several years ago that really just blew me away in terms of how to guard against the love of money and how to build contentment. John Piper, who I talk about all the time because I love him so much, though I've never met him, has written more than 50 books. And he's made millions of dollars from writing his books. Literally millions of dollars. And he's never taken any royalties from any of it. He lives off his pastor's salary and that's it. I want to read an excerpt from an article written 3 years ago where he talks about this. It's a long one, so it won't be on the screen. Just listen to it if you will. It's John Piper speaking. When I began my ministry as pastor at Bethlehem, it had never entered my mind that I would produce a lot of income by writing. I did suspect that if I was faithful, income would rise, and sooner or later I would make more than I needed. Therefore, I believed from the beginning that plans should be put in place to put a governor on laying up treasures on earth. Otherwise, little by little, I might assume that my wants were my needs, and the expenses would expand as they always do to fill the income. So Noelle, his wife, and I put in place a graduated tithe from the beginning. That is, we tried to give a greater percentage with each salary increase, not just a greater amount. With the successful sales of Desiring God starting in 1987, I saw that there could be substantial income from writing and speaking. I resolved that I should not keep any of this money for myself, but channel it through ministry. I never doubted that the Lord would provide for us a salary that would be sufficient for our family. So I saw no reason to keep the money that came in from books and speaking. So we created a foundation. The Desiring God Foundation now owns all the copyrights of my books and intellectual property and receives and distributes all the income. I have no access to the money at all. I have never been in any serious need. None of this has felt like a sacrifice. I know myself incredibly rich by the standards of the world. Beyond all doubt, it is more blessed to give than to receive and keep. What challenged me about the way that Piper lived and still lives to this day is that I realize, along with all Christians, that we need parameters put in place to guard against the love of money. We need parameters put in place to build contentment. If we just wait for it to naturally come, it'll never come. Contentment will never come naturally. So I want to encourage all of us, church family, to put parameters in place to guard against the love of the money. Now, there are many, many ways to do this. I'm going to give you, I didn't number them, they're with letters. What is that, 7 or 8? I want to give 7 or 8 parameters as to how we can do this. And we'll close with this. A, make giving a discipline. Just as we would never want to just read our Bible whenever we feel like it, or how we would never want to just pray when we feel like it, we would hopefully make it a discipline that is built into our life. Make giving a discipline. You know, I know that I'm going to eat this week. This coming week, I know I will eat. You know how I know I'll eat? Because I've disciplined my life to make sure that I eat. I went grocery shopping on Friday for this coming week. I've disciplined my life to make sure it happens. Make giving a discipline. And if that means you have to scale back, if that means you have to go and confess, if that means whatever you need to do, make giving a discipline. B, make Thanksgiving a discipline. Not the holiday, but the practice. Make Thanksgiving a discipline. Nothing destroys contentment faster than complaining. Nothing destroys discontentment faster than complaining. Nothing. Yes. I changed the wording on this. I'm reading my text here. Sorry. Nothing destroys contentment faster than complaining, and nothing builds it faster than Thanksgiving. C, limit our social media internet and entertainment intake. Few things breed discontentment like social media. Because people are always posting pictures of the vacations they went on or what restaurant they went to. And you get this life of like, man, I'm having macaroni and cheese. I'm only in Seattle. I'm not in Fiji. I need a new jacket. Stephen looks really good in that jacket. Right? Same for entertainment, same for browsing, same for online shopping. It's a culture that'll breed discontentment if you don't put governors on it. Limit your social media, entertainment, and browsing activity online. D, don't ask, is this okay? I think often we want to say, is it okay if I buy another jacket? Is it okay if I take another vacation? Is it okay if I buy a third house? Is it okay if I... Don't ask, is this okay? That's always a bad starting point to ask. Ask, does it magnify Christ? Will this magnify Christ? Do my possessions magnify Christ? Does my home magnify Christ? Does my savings magnify Christ? Do my hobbies, vacations, and free time magnify Christ? The Christian life is not about how far can I live, buy, save, and still not be in sin. But how can I make Jesus look as though he is supreme in my life? E, ask yourself, what makes me happy and why? Several years ago, I used to realize that there was a discrepancy when I was playing basketball and when I was not. Even today, I'm like, oh man, no game today. Kind of bummer. Not to say that that's not wrong to feel that way, but I began to realize that there was a discrepancy in my life of when something went this way and went this way and how joyful I was. And some of that is natural, some of that's being human. Or when a new TV show would come out, and I'd be like, yes! And when there would not, why don't they put a new one out? It was very easy to be content as long as I got what I wanted. As long as life went the way I wanted. The real question was, could I be content when I didn't get what I wanted? When life didn't go the way I wanted it? That was the real question. F, remind yourself that we can't take any of it with us. You can't take anything with you. G, remind yourself that we inherit a kingdom and an earth. Whatever you miss out on in this life, you'll get 10 trillion times more in the next. And H, remind yourself that Jesus is enough.